The air in San Miguel was a meal you never ordered but had to eat with every breath. It tasted of coal dust from the smelter, the sour tang of overworked mules, and the sharp, clean scent of curing leather from the saddlery. Underneath it all lay the mineral grit of the Arizona-New Mexico territory itself, a red powder that settled on every hat brim and found its way into the lines around every eye. The sun of 1878 was a hammer, and the wind, whipping through the spiked yucca, was a lash. Evelyn Hart felt it all, a constant assault on the senses she had carefully cultivated in the muted, damp air of Boston. At 24, she was a teacher by trade but a photographer by soul, a secret correspondent for a reformist gazette that believed the truth could be found in the far-flung corners of the nation. She had come west to capture that truth, chasing a story about progress. But what she found was something far more raw. Her heavy wooden camera, with its brass lens and accordion bellows, was a cumbersome anchor to her old life, a strange and delicate machine in a land of brute force. The locals watched her with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. This slender woman with hair the color of autumn leaves, who spent more time staring into a black cloth than she did at the men who tried to catch her eye. They whispered that she was innocent, a virgin in a world that devoured innocence. But they mistook her quiet reserve for naivety. Evelyn was an observer, and she knew that true seeing required stillness. From a ridge overlooking the sprawling gash of the town, Keshi Nantan watched the smoke rise from the smelter stack. To him, the town did not smell of industry. It smelled of impatience, of a deep hunger that gnawed at the land and its people. He was Chiricahua Apache, a warrior who had learned the terrible cost of fighting and the bitter taste of treaties that dissolved like salt in the rain. Now, he walked a narrow path between worlds, earning his keep as a tracker and guide for the district governor, a legal arrangement that chafed like a poorly tanned hide but kept his people safe from the random angers of the settlers. His past was a landscape of ghosts, of battles fought and brothers lost. His eyes, dark and deep-set, missed nothing. They saw the way the new rails of the Pike and Western Railroad gleamed like knife blades, cutting across ancestral lands, pushing ranchers and homesteaders aside with the same casual arrogance it showed his own people. Silas Pike, the man whose name was stamped on every spike and tie, was a name that felt heavy on the tongue, a name that meant trouble. Trouble arrived on the back of a lathered horse, its rider shouting before he even slid from the saddle in front of the sheriff's office. Apaches, they hit the ore wagon from the north. Mine took the whole payroll shipment. The town's lazy afternoon hum erupted into a swarm of angry voices. Men poured out of Murphy's saloon, their fear quickly hardening into a familiar, ugly rage. Sheriff Baines, a man whose gut strained the buttons of his vest, stepped onto the boardwalk, his face a mask of practiced authority. He held up a hand for quiet, though his eyes scanned the crowd, stoking the fire, not calming it. "Now, hold on," he boomed, his voice carrying over the murmurs. "We knew this was coming. They've been getting bolder. Silas Pike himself warned me." The mention of the railroad baron's name gave the anger a direction. It was not just a robbery. It was an attack on progress, on the very idea of San Miguel. Evelyn, hearing the commotion from the small room she rented above the general store, grabbed her satchel of glass plates and her camera. This was the story, not the sanitized version of expansion she was meant to write, but the friction, the fire where two worlds met and burned. She felt a knot of fear in her stomach, a cold counterpoint to the desert heat, but the journalist in her pushed it down. To tell the truth, you had to be willing to look it in the face, no matter how ugly. Meanwhile, a deputy found Keshi mending a bridle in the livery. "Sheriff wants you," the young man said, trying to sound official but unable to hide the nervous tremor in his voice. "Wants you to track him. Says he wants the best." Keshi's hand stilled. He knew what this was, a performance. Baines needed an Apache to hunt Apaches, to give his verdict the scent of authenticity. It was a bitter sort of work, proving his people's innocence by hunting ghosts. He gave a slow, deliberate nod, his face unreadable. He would go. Not for the sheriff, but for his own reasons. A lie left to fester could become a truth in the minds of men, and that was a poison he would not allow to spread. By the time Evelyn reached the scene, a dusty canyon several miles from town, the sun was beginning to dip, casting long, dramatic shadows. The ore wagon lay on its side like a slaughtered beast, its cargo of silver ore glittering uselessly in the dirt. The two drivers were gone, their bodies already taken back to town. A small crowd of men, led by Sheriff Baines, milled about, their boots scuffing away any real evidence. Evelyn ignored them, her focus entirely on her craft. She found a vantage point, set up her heavy tripod, and disappeared under the black focusing cloth. The world inverted in the ground glass, a strange, silent version of the chaotic scene. She worked methodically, her hands steady as she coated a glass plate with collodion, sensitized it in a silver nitrate bath, and loaded it into the camera. Each photograph was a commitment, a slow and deliberate act of capturing a single moment of light. She took a wide shot first, capturing the wagon and the sweep of the canyon walls. Then she moved closer, focusing on the splintered wood of the wagon, the deep gouges in the earth. Keshi arrived on foot, moving with a fluid silence that startled the men standing guard. He did not speak to the sheriff, did not even acknowledge him. His gaze was fixed on the ground, reading the story that the earth held. Baines watched him, a smirk playing on his lips. "See, boys," he said to the men around him. "Takes a savage to catch a savage." Keshi ignored the insult. His eyes followed the chaos of tracks, filtering out the clumsy prints of the townsmen. He saw where the wagon's mules had panicked. He saw where men had leaped from the rocks above. But he also saw what was not there. There were no marks of the knee-high moccasins his people wore, fashioned for silence and speed. Instead, he found a clear, deep impression near a patch of disturbed gravel. It was the print of a heavy, square-toed boot, its sole studded with a pattern of hobnails, the kind of boot worn by Gandhi dancers, the men who laid track for the railroad. He knelt, his fingers hovering over the indentation, a cold certainty hardening in his gut. This was a lie written in the dirt. He followed the line of the print, his eyes catching something else. Baines's men had missed a single, dark feather, not from an eagle, but from a common crow, dyed and clipped to look like a warrior's token. It was an amateur's mistake, an insult. As he stood, his gaze swept the scene and fell upon Evelyn. He saw her there, a strange figure with her three-legged machine, her head hidden under a dark shroud. She was a complication he did not need, another white person documenting a fiction. Their eyes met for a brief moment as she emerged from under the cloth. She saw an intensity in his stare that was unnerving, a silent appraisal that seemed to see right through her. He saw a woman who did not flinch, whose gaze was direct and questioning. Evelyn, her senses heightened by the tension, turned her camera slightly, reframing her shot to include the spot where the Apache tracker was looking so intently. It seemed important. She did not know why. She saw only the disturbed patch of earth, but the light was good, and the details would be sharp. She slid the plate holder into the camera, pulled the dark slide, and uncapped the lens, counting the seconds in her head before capping it again. The light burned the image onto the wet glass, capturing the truth of the scene, a truth she did not yet understand. Keshi turned away and walked back towards the sheriff, his expression a stony mask. "They went east," he said, his voice low and even, "towards the broken mesas. A half-dozen men, riding hard." He offered them a direction, a piece of a truth that would lead them on a fruitless chase, buying him time to think. Baines clapped him on the shoulder. "Good work. We'll ride at dawn." The sheriff was satisfied. He had his story, and now he had his Apache witness to back it up. As the men prepared to leave, Evelyn began packing her delicate equipment. She felt a profound sense of unease. The scene was too neat, the story too simple. The way the Apache tracker had looked at the ground, and then at her, felt like a silent warning. She glanced back at the spot she had just photographed and saw something she had missed before, a small metal object half buried in the dirt, catching the last rays of the sun. A railroad spike, identical to the hundreds she had seen being hammered into the earth by Silas Pike's crews. It was probably nothing, a piece of refuse in a territory being crisscrossed by iron. But in that moment, it felt like a signature. Later that night, San Miguel simmered. In the saloon, men drank to justice and vengeance, their voices loud and their certainty absolute. On the porch of his newly built office, Silas Pike stood with Sheriff Baines, their cigars glowing like angry eyes in the twilight. "A tragedy," Pike said, his voice pitched for the benefit of any passers-by. "A clear message from the savages that they will not accept progress, but they will find that Pike and Western will not be intimidated." In her small room, Evelyn worked by the dim, acrid light of a kerosene lamp. She carefully poured the developing solution over her last glass plate, the one she had taken of the ground where the tracker had stood. The image slowly materialized, emerging from the creamy white background like a memory surfacing. First, the dark shapes of the rocks and gravel. Then, the deep, clear shadow of the hobnailed boot print. And right beside it, rendered in perfect, sharp detail, lay the railroad spike, its distinctive P&W stamp clearly visible. She stared at the image, her heart beating a little faster. It was just a boot print. It was just a spike, but they were together. The wet plate held a story, different from the one the sheriff was telling. It was a secret, waiting in the dark for someone to bring it into the light. She thought of the Apache tracker's eyes, the way they had scanned the earth, and she knew, with a certainty that chilled her, that he had seen it too. They were strangers, a Chiricahua warrior and a Boston schoolteacher, but the red dust of San Miguel had just bound their paths together. Justice, she was beginning to understand, did not start with a shout, but with a quiet observation. The schoolhouse was a lean-to of corrugated tin that sang a high, sharp song when the wind blew and baked like an oven under the midday sun. Inside, the heat was a physical presence, smelling of chalk dust, sweat, and the wild mint the Mexican children sometimes brought in their pockets. Evelyn's students were a patchwork quilt of San Miguel's future, the pale, freckled children of Irish miners, the dark-eyed sons and daughters of Mexican laborers whose families had been there before the town had a name, and a few quiet, watchful children of mixed blood, who straddled two worlds and belonged fully to neither. She taught them their letters and numbers. But more than that, she tried to teach them how to see, to look at the world with questions instead of assumptions. She had just finished a lesson on geography, trying to explain the vastness of the ocean to children who had only ever known the immensity of the desert, when a long shadow fell across the open doorway. Keshi Nantan stood there, his frame filling the entrance. The children fell silent, their eyes wide. He was not a common sight in the town itself, and his presence carried an air of the wilderness, of places beyond the reach of the smelter's smoke. Evelyn's heart gave a little jump, a flicker of the same unease she had felt in the canyon. She stepped forward, shielding the children with her body by instinct. "Martha Doyle sent me," he said, his voice quiet, yet it carried easily through the small space. "She said you were looking for a guide to the mines." Evelyn remembered her conversation with the boarding house owner. She had expressed a desire to photograph the mining operations, the great scars in the hills and the men who worked them. Martha, a woman whose pragmatism was as solid as the rock candy she sold, had been firm. "You are not going up there alone. Child, it is no place for a woman on her own. I know a man. He is quiet, but he knows the land better than the lizards do. He is the only one I would trust with my own kin." Now, facing him, Evelyn understood. There was a stillness about him that was the opposite of the town's nervous energy. It was a deep, rooted calm that felt more trustworthy than any loud proclamation. "Yes," she said, her voice more steady than she expected. I need someone who can get me to the overlook at the North Mine. Safely." He gave a single, slow nod. "I can do that." He did not smile, but his eyes softened almost imperceptibly as he glanced at the children huddled behind her. He saw the way she stood, a small but determined barrier between them and the unknown. He saw a protector. That night, the argument between progress and the past took a louder, more violent turn. A powerful explosion ripped through the darkness, shaking the flimsy wooden buildings of San Miguel and rattling the glass in Evelyn's window. It was another ore wagon, this one parked on a siding near the main rail line, waiting for morning transport. The blast was followed by the hungry roar of fire. Within minutes, the street was full of panicked citizens. Silas Pike was there first, his face a grim mask in the flickering firelight, flanked by Sheriff Baines. Retaliation. Pike's voice was a steel whip, cutting through the confusion. "They are attacking the railroad itself now. This is what happens when you show weakness. This is their answer to our posse." The accusation landed like a lit match in a puddle of kerosene. The mob, directionless moments before, now had a target. Baines, taking his cue, deputized a half-dozen of Pike's railroad men on the spot, their faces hard and eager in the orange glow. "We need to make an example," Baines declared. "We will find who did this, and they will see what San Miguel's justice looks like." Their search did not take long, because it was not a search for truth, but for a symbol. They found him in the Mexican Quarter, a young Chiricahua named Taza, who had come to town to trade for flour and medicine for his grandmother. He was barely a man, his face still holding the softness of youth. They dragged him from the small adobe he was visiting, ignoring his protests and the pleas of the family sheltering him. They brought him to the center of town, to the new water tower that stood as a monument to Silas Pike's civic generosity. A rope appeared, thick and coarse. The crowd's fear had curdled into a feverish, collective rage. They saw in Taza's face not a boy far from home, but the embodiment of all their anxieties, the savage threat from the wilderness. Keshi felt the explosion's tremor in the soles of his feet. He knew, with a sickening certainty, what would follow. He moved through the back alleys, a shadow among shadows, and saw the mob surrounding the water tower. He saw the boy, Taza, his hands bound, his eyes wide with a terror that had not yet given way to despair. Evelyn was there too, drawn by the fire and the shouting. She had her camera, though her hands trembled as she set up the tripod. This was not a story of friction. This was a prelude to a hanging. Her stomach twisted with a revulsion so profound it was nearly paralyzing. Her editor's voice echoed in her mind. A telegram that had arrived that afternoon. "Reports of Indian trouble. Need dramatic copy. Capture the conflict. The East is hungry for the Wild West." She looked from the terrified boy to the hateful faces in the crowd and felt a surge of shame. This was not drama. This was a murder in the making. Keshi stepped out of the darkness and into the firelight. He did not shout. He simply walked through the crowd, which parted before him, their drunken bravado momentarily faltering in the face of his cold calm. He stopped before Sheriff Baines. "This is not justice," Keshi said, his voice level. "This is a crime. The boy has had no trial." Baines laughed. "A short, ugly bark. We are the trial, Keshi, and the jury. And in about 5 minutes, we are going to be the executioner. Now get out of the way before you end up swinging next to him." "He was not there," Keshi stated. "A simple fact against a tidal wave of emotion. I know his family. He is not a warrior." "They are all warriors," one of Pike's men snarled, shoving Keshi's shoulder. That was the only opening Keshi needed. He moved with a speed that was almost invisible. He did not strike the man. He simply used the man's momentum, redirecting him, and in a fluid motion, relieved him of the knife at his belt. Keshi spun. the blade a silver arc in the firelight, and sliced through the thick rope that had been slung over a crossbeam of the water tower. The severed end fell to the ground with a soft thud. For a heartbeat, the crowd was stunned into silence. In that moment, Evelyn acted. She raised her flashpan, a mixture of magnesium powder ready. She saw one of the men near the boy, one of the newly deputized railroad workers, fumbling to retie the rope on the back of his heavy work glove. She saw it, the faint, stenciled letters P and W. She aimed her lens, opened the shutter, and squeezed the trigger for the flash. A brilliant, blinding white light erupted, followed by a thick cloud of white smoke. The mob cried out, shielding their eyes. Horses reared. In that instant of manufactured chaos, Keshi moved again. He cut the bindings on Taza's wrists. "Run," he said in their shared tongue. "Run to the river and do not stop." The boy needed no other encouragement. He vanished into the same shadows from which Keshi had emerged. The momentary blindness passed, replaced by a renewed, more focused rage. But now it was directed at Keshi, who stood alone, the small knife held loosely in his hand. He was not cornered. He was ready. He met their glares, his eyes promising a cost they were not truly willing to pay. He saw Evelyn by her strange machine, her face pale but her expression resolute. She had not screamed. She had not run. She had created the light that gave the boy his chance. Baines, his face purple with fury, pulled his pistol. "That is enough. You are under arrest for interfering with justice." But the momentum was broken. The mob's bloodlust had been interrupted, and now, with the intended victim gone, it began to cool into a grumbling uncertainty. Taking on a lone, armed Apache was a different proposition than hanging a bound boy. Silas Pike, ever the pragmatist, stepped forward and put a calming hand on the sheriff's arm. "Let him go." "Sheriff," Pike said smoothly, "he will not get far. His actions tonight have condemned his whole tribe. We now have all the proof we need of their treachery." He turned his cold eyes on Keshi. "You have bought this boy a few hours of life, but you have started a war you cannot win." Keshi held Pike's gaze for a long moment before melting back into the night, the knife gone as mysteriously as it had appeared. The crowd dispersed, leaving Evelyn alone in the sudden quiet, the smell of burnt magnesium sharp in her nostrils. She packed her equipment, her mind racing. She had seen the look on Keshi's face, a fierce and terrible grief. He was not a savage. He was a man pushed to the very edge, defending his people with the only tools he had. She felt a hesitant, fragile thread of understanding forming between them, a trust born in a moment of shared defiance. Back in the suffocating privacy of her room, she developed the night's plates. The first one was exactly as she had hoped. The image of the railroad glove was sharp and undeniable. The P&W logo a clear indictment. It was evidence. But it was the second plate that made her breath catch in her throat. It was a wider shot of the initial explosion, taken just as the flames had crested. In the chaotic, hellish light, a figure was illuminated, turning away from the burning wagon. The face was obscured by shadow and distance, but the build, the confident set of the shoulders, and the distinctive hat were unmistakable. It was Jedediah Stone, Silas Pike's crew foreman, a man she had seen just yesterday, barking orders at the men laying track. He was not supposed to be there. He was supposed to be miles away, at the end of the line. The pieces clicked into place with a terrifying certainty. The boot print, the railroad spike, the glove, and now, the foreman at the scene of the fire. This was not a war started by the Apache. It was a war being manufactured, piece by bloody piece, by the Pike and Western Railroad. And she, with her box of glass and light, was standing right in the middle of it. The editor in Boston wanted a story about the Wild West. Evelyn Hart now realized she was about to give him one that was far wilder and far more dangerous than he could ever imagine. She found him at dawn on the edge of town, where the last dusty street gave way to the open scrubland. He was not hard to find for someone who was looking. He sat with his back against a low mesa, watching the sun paint the eastern sky in shades of rose and gold. He seemed a part of the landscape, as patient and enduring as the rock itself. Evelyn approached quietly, her boots making soft sounds in the sand. In her hands, she carried the glass plate, carefully wrapped in black velvet. She did not need to speak his name. He knew she was there. When she was a few feet away, he turned his head, his dark eyes unreadable in the morning light. "I have something to show you," she said, her voice barely a whisper. She knelt and unwrapped the photograph, angling it to catch the new light. "I took this during the fire." Keshi looked at the image, his gaze sharp and focused. He saw the flames, the chaos, and the figure of the man turning away. He did not need her to point him out. He recognized Jedediah Stone, the railroad foreman, a man whose arrogance was as plain as the pistol on his hip. He then looked at Evelyn, a new understanding in his eyes. This woman, with her box of captured light, had seen the truth. "They use oil," he said, his voice a low rumble, "to make the fires burn so hot and fast. I found traces of it at the first wagon. There is a place they must store it, a depot away from the town where no one would think to look." "Can you find it?" she asked. "Finding it is not the difficult part," he replied, his gaze sweeping over the vast, empty expanse to the east, the Llano Estacado, the staked plain, a place that swallowed men whole, a flat, featureless sea of grass and sun that baked the sense out of a person. "Surviving the journey is—" "I am coming with you," she said. It was not a request. Her fear was a cold knot in her belly, but the image on the glass plate was a heavier weight. To know the truth and do nothing felt like a worse danger than any desert. He studied her for a long time, taking in her determined face, her city clothes so unsuited for the trial ahead, and the fierce, unyielding light in her eyes. He saw a foolishness born of courage, and he could not bring himself to deny it. He gave a single, sharp nod. "Travel light," he said, "and bring more water than you think you will ever need." The Llano Estacado was not empty. It was full of heat, distance, and a silence so profound it rang in the ears. The sun was a merciless god, and the horizon was a featureless line that never seemed to get any closer. Within hours, Evelyn's respectable Boston dress was coated in a fine layer of dust, and her throat felt as if it were lined with sand. The world was reduced to the rhythmic creak of her boots, the steady, ground-covering pace of the man in front of her, and the constant, nagging demand of her own thirst. Keshi moved through this unforgiving landscape as if it were his home. He taught her not with lectures, but with actions. He showed her how to wrap her scarf over her nose and mouth to filter the dust-choked air, a simple act that made each breath less of a battle. He pointed to the way the sparse grasses bent, showing her how to read the language of the wind, to anticipate the gusts that could steal the moisture from your very skin. They did not speak much. Words were an extravagance the desert did not afford. Their communication became a shared rhythm of walking, resting, and drinking sparingly from their canteens. Once, as they paused in the meager shade of a lone mesquite tree, Evelyn watched a committee of vultures circle high above, black specks against a painfully blue sky. They were waiting. The thought sent a shiver through her despite the heat. "They have more patience than men," Keshi said, following her gaze. He unstoppered his canteen and offered it to her. She shook her head, pointing to her own, which was still half full. He insisted with a slight gesture. She drank, the lukewarm water a gift beyond price. "My mother taught me that water is the memory of the earth," he said, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. "It remembers every stone it has touched, every root it has nourished. When we drink, we are drinking that memory. It reminds us that even in the driest places, life is still hidden, waiting." Evelyn looked at him, at the deep lines the sun had carved around his eyes, and saw not just a guide, but a man who held a universe of knowledge she could not begin to comprehend. Her world of books and theories felt thin and brittle out here. Here, truth was about survival. It was about finding the hidden memories of the earth before the sun and the vultures claimed your own. They found the mercenaries on the third day. The flat plain had begun to break into a series of shallow, rocky canyons, a maze of stone and shadow. Keshi sensed them before he saw them, a subtle shift in the air, a wrongness. He held up a hand, and they froze, melting into the cover of a rock outcropping. Below them, in a narrow passage, 3 men were resting their horses. They wore the rough clothes of railroad workers, and their faces were hard and cruel. One of them was complaining loudly about the heat, about the waiting. "Pike is not paying us enough to cook out here. I say we finish the job tonight and get back to whiskey that is not warm enough to bathe in." The proof was laid bare, a casual admission of guilt spoken into the canyon silence. Keishi's hand went to the knife at his belt. His plan was to wait for darkness, to slip past them, but one of the men's horses, smelling their presence, whickered and stamped its feet. The man looked up, his eyes narrowing. What was that? There was no more time for stealth. The next moments were a blur of violent motion. Keishi pushed Evelyn behind a large boulder, his voice a low command. "Stay down." He moved like a phantom, a silent, deadly force. A rock, thrown with incredible accuracy, struck one of the men in the temple, sending him tumbling from his saddle. Before the other 2 could react, Keishi was on them. He was not fighting for honor or glory. He was fighting to end a threat, with a brutal efficiency that was terrifying to behold. A pistol shot rang out, the sound deafening in the confined space. The bullet ricocheted off the canyon wall with a sharp whine. The second shot was truer. Evelyn heard a soft grunt and saw Keishi stagger for a second, a dark patch blossoming on his left shoulder. But he did not fall. He closed the distance with the shooter, and the fight was over in a matter of seconds. The second man fell, and the third, seeing he was alone, spurred his horse and fled, disappearing down the canyon. Silence returned, heavy and thick with the scent of gunpowder and fear. Evelyn rushed out from behind the rock. Keishi was standing, his breathing harsh, his hand pressed against his shoulder. When he pulled it away, it was covered in blood. For a moment, she could not move. The sight of the dark, freely flowing blood, the raw reality of the wound, turned her limbs to ice. This was not a photograph. This was flesh and blood, torn and bleeding in front of her. The world tilted, a wave of nausea washing over her. Then she saw his eyes. He was watching her, his expression tight with pain. But there was a question in his gaze. He was assessing her, waiting to see if she would break. That look, more than anything else, broke through her fear. She would not be a liability. She would not fall apart. "Sit," she commanded, her voice shaking only slightly. "Let me see it." He obeyed, lowering himself to the ground, his back against the warm rock. She gently pushed his hand aside and tore the fabric of his shirt to get a better look. The bullet had torn a ragged furrow through the muscle of his shoulder. It was a deep graze, bleeding badly, but the bullet had passed through. She took a deep breath, forcing her mind to be as methodical as when she prepared a glass plate. She rummaged through her satchel, past the delicate photographic equipment, and found her small emergency kit. It contained a flask of whiskey, a needle, and a spool of silk thread. "This will hurt," she said, her voice soft. He gave a slight nod. His jaw clenched. "The waiting hurts more." She uncorked the flask and poured the fiery liquid directly into the wound. He flinched, a sharp intake of breath hissing through his teeth, but he made no other sound. His stoicism gave her strength. She cleaned the wound as best she could, her hands becoming steady, her focus absolute. Threading the needle was the hardest part. Her fingers felt clumsy, and the tiny eye seemed to mock her. But she did it. She took another breath and pushed the needle into his skin. He did not move, did not make a sound, though she saw the muscles in his neck corded tight. She made the first stitch, then the second, her movements becoming more confident. It was a crude, ugly seam, but it pulled the edges of the wound together, and the bleeding slowed to a trickle. When she was finished, she tore a strip from her petticoat and fashioned a clean bandage. Her hands were covered in his blood. The intimacy of the act of tending to his body in this desperate, violent place was a bond stronger than any words they had exchanged. She sat back on her heels, exhausted. He looked at her, and the distance that had always been in his eyes was gone. In its place was something new, a raw and vulnerable respect. "You have a surgeon's hands," he murmured. "I have a photographer's hands," she corrected gently. "They are only good for paying attention to details." He looked at the new raw scar taking shape on his shoulder, another line in the story written on his skin. He had spent his life protecting his people, and the cost was measured in scars like this. But this wound felt different. He had not received it defending his past, but defending a future he had not known he was seeking. He had brought this woman into his world, and he had nearly gotten her killed. The weight of that responsibility was heavier than the pain in his shoulder. Evelyn, looking at the blood on her hands, felt a profound shift within herself. She had come west to observe and report, to keep a safe, objective distance. But there was no distance here. She had cleaned a wound, stitched flesh, and faced down a fear that had threatened to swallow her whole. The line between the observer and the participant had been washed away in salt and blood, and in its place, a new, unshakable truth was beginning to form. Murphy's saloon had never been a place of quiet contemplation, but it had never been a courtroom either. Sheriff Baines, however, was a man of limited imagination. To him, the largest room in town with the most chairs was the logical place to dispense the town's particular brand of justice. He sat behind a large poker table, a gavel in his meaty fist, looking every bit the self-important man playing a role he did not fully understand. Before him, seated on hastily arranged benches, was a jury of 12 men. Evelyn recognized every one of them. They were miners on Pike's payroll, store owners who depended on the railroad's business, and ranchers who had been promised favorable shipping rates. It was a jury of the bought and the beholden. Their purpose was to legitimize the punishment of the Chiricahua, with Taza gone. Baines had simply arrested another man, an elder named Nache who had come to town for salt. Nache stood before the poker table, his face a mask of weary dignity, his hands bound in front of him. He did not speak, knowing that any words he offered would be twisted into a confession. The air was thick with the smell of stale beer and fresh prejudice. Silas Pike was not at the table, but he stood near the bar, observing the proceedings with a detached satisfaction, a king watching his pawns perform. "This is an open and shut case." Baines was booming, his voice echoing in the crowded room. "We have all seen the savagery with our own eyes. 2 wagons destroyed, good men lost. This is not theft, this is war. And in war, there is only one sentence." He banged the gavel for emphasis. It was at that moment that Evelyn Hart walked through the swinging doors. She was followed by Keshi, his left arm held stiffly at his side, his presence a silent challenge that made a dozen men shift uncomfortably in their seats. And with them was a man whose face was unfamiliar to most, but whose quiet integrity was known to the Mexican and Chiricahua families, Attorney Del Rio, a lawyer from a neighboring district who believed the law was meant to be a shield for the powerless, not a club for the mighty. A murmur went through the crowd. A woman, an Apache, and a Mexican lawyer. It was the start of a joke Baines was in no mood to hear. "What is the meaning of this?" the sheriff demanded, his face flushing with anger. "This is an official proceeding." "It is precisely because it is an official proceeding that we are here, Sheriff," Del Rio said, his voice calm and clear, cutting through the saloon's grimy atmosphere. He placed a worn leather satchel on an empty table. "My client, Mr. Nache, has a right to a defense, and we have evidence to present." Pike's men on the jury laughed openly. "Evidence," one of them called out. "We got all the evidence we need burning out by the tracks." "On the contrary," Evelyn said, her voice stronger than she thought possible. She stepped forward and placed her heavy wooden box of glass plates next to Del Rio's satchel. She unwrapped one and held it up for all to see. It was the image of the boot print and the railroad spike. This is the evidence from the first wagon. A boot print made by a railroad worker, and a spike stamped with the PNW insignia found at the scene. Bain squinted at the plate. That proves nothing. A man can lose a spike anywhere. Evelyn produced a second plate, the one from the night of the fire, and this is a work glove, also with the PNW logo, worn by one of the men who was about to hang an innocent boy. The men in the room grumbled, their certainties shaken by the cold. Hard facts captured in her photographs. The images were not opinions. They were not memories. They were light and silver, an objective and incorruptible witness. These are nothing but tricks of light, Pike said, finally speaking. His voice was not loud, but it carried a weight that silenced the room. A woman's fancies captured in a box. It is a known fact that these machines can be made to lie. Del Rio stepped forward. The photographs do not lie, Mr. Pike, and neither do the federal treaties you have so conveniently ignored. The 1866 Land Grant Act is quite specific. Railroads are granted right-of-way, but they are not granted the right to forcibly remove homesteaders or to violate the sovereign boundaries of designated tribal lands. Boundaries which your new spur line has crossed without permit or negotiation. He pulled a map from his satchel, a government survey map, and spread it on the table. He pointed to a line drawn in red ink, the Pike and Western line. And here, he said, his finger tracing an older, fainter line, is the boundary of the Chiricahua Reservation as agreed to by treaty. Your tracks are a mile inside that line. You are trespassing, Mr. Pike, and these attacks, conveniently blamed on the Apache, serve as a perfect excuse to drive them off land you are attempting to steal. The accusation hung in the air, sharp and undeniable. The jury members looked at each other, their bought loyalty warring with the uncomfortable ring of truth. "He is the liar!" Baines shouted, pointing a trembling finger at Keshi. "This savage is the one who leads the raids. Let him speak. Let us hear his lies for ourselves." "I will speak," Keshi said. He stepped forward, his eyes sweeping over the hostile faces. He did not look at Pike or Baines. He looked at the men of the town, the miners, the ranchers. "I did not lead a raid. I tracked the men who did. They wore the boots of railroad workers. They smelled not of wood smoke and pinon, but of machine oil and cheap whiskey. They left the signs of careless men, not of warriors." "And what would you know of warriors?" one of the jurors sneered. "Were you not one of them? Did you not fight against us at Apache Pass?" The mood in the room turned uglier. They were not interested in his testimony, only in his past. They wanted to discredit the man to discredit the evidence. "I have fought." "Yes," Keshi said, his voice dropping low, each word heavy with memory. "I have seen enough killing to last a lifetime. I fight no more. I seek only to live in peace. But men like him," he said, his gaze finally settling on Silas Pike, "do not understand peace. They only understand profit. They will burn this whole valley to the ground to save a few dollars on their route." "Enough," Baines roared, banging his gavel so hard the table jumped. "I have heard enough lies. This is a mockery of justice. The jury will deliver its verdict." It was a foregone conclusion. The foreman of the jury, a burly mine supervisor, stood up, a smug look on his face. "We find the Apache guilty." A cheer went up in the saloon. The law of the mob had won. Baines smiled, his authority restored. The sentence is to be carried out at sundown. A lesson must be taught. But the lesson was interrupted. The swinging doors of the saloon pushed open again, admitting a rectangle of harsh, bright sunlight. A man stood silhouetted in the doorway. He was not large, nor was he dressed in the flamboyant style of a gunfighter. He wore the simple, dusty clothes of a man who spent most of his time in the saddle, but on his vest was a small, five-pointed star, and it caught the light, shining with an authority that made the sheriff's tin badge look like a toy. "I would advise against that." "Sheriff," the man said, his voice calm and steady. He stepped inside, his eyes taking in the scene with a quick, Professional assessment, the bound elder. The sham jury, the triumphant railroad baron. "And who are you to advise me?" Baines blustered, though his confidence had visibly deflated. The man walked to the center of the room. "Federal Marshal Andrew Fletcher. I am tracking a bank robber who was last seen heading toward this district, but it appears I have stumbled upon a different sort of crime altogether." His gaze fell on the map, then on Evelyn's photographs. He looked at Del Rio, giving a slight nod of professional respect. He looked at Nache, his eyes softening with something that looked like pity. Finally, he looked at Sheriff Baines. "This is not a court of law, Sheriff," Fletcher said, his voice flat and final. "This is a saloon full of angry men. Whatever justice you think you are dispensing here is a farce. Untie the prisoner." For a moment, Baines seemed ready to argue. He looked to Silas Pike for support, but Pike's face was a careful, neutral mask. He knew the limits of his influence. A local sheriff could be bought, but a federal marshal was a different kind of animal, an agent of a power that reached all the way to Washington. Baines hesitated, then sullenly motioned for one of his deputies to cut Nache's bonds. Marshal Fletcher turned to the room at large. "This proceeding is concluded. The prisoner is released for lack of any credible evidence presented in a legitimate court. I suggest you all go back to your business." He did not raise his voice. He did not draw his weapon, but his words had the force of a landslide, scattering the mob's certainty. The men of the jury looked at their feet, avoiding Pike's gaze. The crowd began to mutter and shuffle out, the spectacle over. One of the jurors, emboldened by whiskey, paused as he passed Evelyn. "You would do well to remember your place," he snarled under his breath. "A woman should not teach the men of the West their business." The threat was quiet, but it was as sharp and cold as a knife blade. Soon, only a few people remained in the saloon: Evelyn, Casey, and Del Rio. Standing with the now free Nache, Marshal Fletcher stood by the table, examining one of Evelyn's glass plates with a thoughtful expression. Silas Pike and Sheriff Baines watched them from the bar, their faces dark with thwarted rage. A temporary peace had been won, not by a gun, but by a map, a photograph, and a simple badge of office. But Evelyn knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that the real fight for San Miguel had only just begun. The law had come to town, but the law of the jungle was not ready to surrender. The victory in the saloon was as thin and fragile as a pane of glass. It had stopped one injustice, but it had also shown Silas Pike that the law, when wielded by honest hands, was a genuine threat. And Pike was not a man who tolerated threats. He preferred to eliminate them. The warning came on the wind, carried by a young Mexican boy whose uncle worked the freight lines. He had overheard men talking at a watering hole far down the line. Men with black flags stitched crudely onto their saddlebags. They spoke of a town that needed to be taught a lesson, of a photographer who saw too much, and an Apache who had forgotten his place. They were coming tonight. Marshal Andrew Fletcher did not waste time with doubt. He gathered the small group that had stood against Baines in the saloon: Evelyn, Keshi, and attorney Del Rio. He also sent for Martha Doyle, whose boarding house was the town's unofficial heart, and a handful of ranchers and miners he had sized up as men who would not be easily bought or bullied. They met in the back room of the general store, the air thick with the smell of coffee beans and impending violence. "They will not come from the front," Casey said, his finger tracing a line in the dust on the floor, sketching a map of San Miguel. "The main street is a bottleneck. They will come from the south, using the arroyo for cover, and they will hit the warehouse district first, to burn your records, your supplies, to create chaos." Fletcher nodded, his eyes narrowed in concentration. "Panic is the goal. They will try to divide us, make us run in circles while they pick off their real targets." He looked directly at Evelyn, then at Keshi. "And make no mistake, you two are the real targets." A plan began to form, a collaboration between two different worlds. Fletcher, the lawman, thought in terms of fields of fire, barricades, and command structures. Keshi, the warrior, thought in terms of shadows, diversions, and the natural pathways of the land. Together, they devised a two-tiered defense. A main group of riflemen, led by Fletcher, would hold a line along the edge of the warehouse district, a direct show of force. A second, smaller group, led by Keshi, would hide in the rocks and gullies to the west, waiting to strike the attackers on their flank once they were engaged. "We need a signal," Fletcher said, looking at the crude map. "A way to coordinate the flank attack." All eyes turned to Evelyn. "The water tower," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "It is the highest point. I can use a lantern, 1 light when they are sighted, 2 when they are fully committed to the attack. That will be your signal to move." Keishi's expression tightened. "It is the most exposed place in town. They will see the light. They will come for you." "That is why I must be the one to do it," she replied. Meeting his gaze, "They are coming for me anyway. I would rather face them on my own terms, as a participant, not as a victim hiding under a bed." In that moment, she felt the last vestiges of the Boston Observer fall away. She was no longer just a teller of stories. She was part of the story, her choices shaping its outcome. The weight of her camera felt like a memory from another life. The weight of the heavy lantern she now held was the reality of the present. As twilight bled across the sky, turning the red dust to a deep purple, the town transformed. It was no longer a collection of individuals seeking their fortune. It was a community bracing for a fight. Men who had argued over water rights now stood shoulder to shoulder, checking their rifles. Martha Doyle organized the other women, preparing bandages and buckets of water. The tension was a living thing, a hum that vibrated in the cooling air. Keishi walked with Evelyn to the base of the water tower. His shoulder was a dull, persistent ache, a reminder of the violence that had brought them to this night. He looked at the tall, skeletal frame of the tower, and then at her face pale but resolute in the gathering dark. He wanted to tell her not to go, to stay on the ground where he could protect her, but he saw the same stubborn courage in her that he had seen in the desert. And he knew that to deny her this role would be to deny the very spirit he had come to admire. "Be watchful," he said, the words feeling inadequate. "You too," she whispered. He reached out, his fingers brushing against hers, a brief, fleeting contact that sent a jolt through them both. Then he was gone, a shadow disappearing towards the western rocks. Evelyn climbed the long ladder, the lantern banging against the rungs. From the top, the whole of San Miguel was laid out before her, a scattering of yellow lights against an immense darkness. She felt terribly alone, a single point of light in a sea of shadow. But she also felt a strange sense of purpose. This was her post. This was her stand. They came near midnight. First, a distant rumble, a vibration felt more than heard. Then, the unmistakable sound of dozens of horses moving at speed. A line of dark shapes emerged from the arroyo, flowing toward the warehouses like a black tide. Evelyn's hand trembled as she uncovered the lantern's lens, sending a single, steady beam of light into the night. The attack began with a volley of torches, fiery arcs that sailed through the air and landed on the dry wooden roofs of the warehouses. The first building caught with a whoosh, flames climbing eagerly into the sky. Gunfire erupted, the sharp crack of Fletcher's men's rifles answered by the deeper roar of the attackers' guns. The night exploded into a nightmare of shouting, whinnying horses, and the constant, deafening report of firearms. A rain of sparks and burning embers drifted on the wind. Evelyn held her position, her knuckles white where she gripped the railing. She watched the main body of the Black Flag gang charge forward, focusing all their attention on Fletcher's line. They were committed. She took a deep breath, uncovered the second lantern, and sent 2 bright beams stabbing into the darkness. The signal. But someone had seen her. A shout went up from below, and she saw 3 of the riders break away from the main group, galloping straight for the water tower. She doused her lights, plunging the platform into darkness. But it was too late. They knew she was there. She scrambled down the ladder, her heart hammering against her ribs. She had to get away from the tower, to draw them away from the center of the fight. She ran, her only thought to find cover. She darted between two buildings and found herself in a narrow alley that ended in a high fence, a dead end. Her only escape was up. She found a stack of crates and used them to haul herself onto the low, sloping roof of the saddlery. The corrugated tin was slick with dew and ash. She crawled across the surface on her hands and knees, the sounds of the battle raging just a street away. Below her, she heard the men's rough voices as they entered the alley. She came this way, spread out. She froze, pressing herself flat against the tin. A bullet splintered the wooden facade of the building next to her. They were shooting blindly, trying to flush her out. She had to move. She started to crawl again, but her boots slipped on a patch of wet ash. For a terrifying second, she was sliding, scrabbling for a handhold that was not there. She cried out, a small, sharp sound, as her body slid over the edge of the roof. She did not hit the ground. A body slammed into hers, a hard, solid impact that knocked the wind from her lungs. An arm of steel wrapped around her waist, breaking her fall and pulling her into the deep shadows of an open doorway. It was Keshi. He had seen the riders break off. His flank attack had been launched, sowing confusion in the enemy's ranks. But his eyes had been fixed on the water tower, on the spot where her light had been. He saw her desperate flight, and his heart had seized with a cold, primal fear. They stumbled into the darkness of the building, the air suddenly cool and smelling sharply of salt. They were in the town's salt warehouse. Keshi barred the heavy door just as the riders appeared at the end of the alley. Outside, the world was fire and thunder. Inside, the silence was almost as deafening. The thick adobe walls muffled the sounds of the fight, reducing it to a dull, rhythmic thumping, like a distant heartbeat. The only light was a faint orange glow filtering through a high, grimy window. They stood in the deep gloom, their chests heaving, their breath coming in ragged gasps. Evelyn was pressed against him, her hands flat against his chest. She could feel the powerful, rapid beat of his heart under her palm. He still had his arm around her, holding her as if he might never let go. In that moment, the chaos outside ceased to matter. The fear of bullets and fire was nothing compared to the terrifying, overwhelming realization that washed over them both. It was not the fear of her own death that had made her cry out. It was the fear of what was happening to the town, to him, and for Keshi, the warrior who had faced death 100 times. The icy dread he had felt watching her fall was a terror unlike any he had ever known. It was the fear of losing her. He slowly loosened his grip, his hand moving to cup her face, his thumb gently brushing a smudge of ash from her cheek. She looked up at him, her eyes wide and luminous in the dim light. No words were spoken. None were needed. The truth of what was between them was suddenly as real and as solid as the ground beneath their feet. A truth forged in the desert and baptized in fire. The sounds of the battle began to change. The wild, chaotic shooting was replaced by more sporadic, focused shots. Shouts of anger were turning into cries of surrender. Fletcher's plan, Keshi's attack, and the town's courage were working. They stayed in the silence of the salt house for a long time, listening to the battle die down. The night's violence had stripped away everything but the essential. And the essential truth was this: their lives were now irrevocably tangled, and the thought of being pulled apart was the most frightening thing in the world. Later, when the last shot had been fired, Marshal Fletcher stood over a captured man, his hands bound securely. The man was a lieutenant of the Black Flag Gang, his face bruised and his arrogance gone, replaced by the sullen fear of a man facing a rope. "Who hired you?" Fletcher's voice was cold iron. The man spat on the ground. "Go to hell." Fletcher just waited. The silence stretched, filled only by the crackle of the still-burning warehouse. Finally, the man broke. It was Pike, he mumbled, his eyes on the ground. "Silas Pike. He paid us to burn it all down." The sun rose on a town that had been to war with itself and won. The air, thick with the ghosts of gunpowder and smoke, carried a new scent as well. The clean, sharp smell of splintered pine and the determination of a community sweeping up the ashes. San Miguel was wounded, but its spine was not broken. The Black Flag Gang was scattered, their leader confessing in Marshal Fletcher's makeshift jail cell. A fragile, exhausted peace settled with the morning dust. In the red-tinged gloom of her dark room, Evelyn Hart worked with a methodical grace that belied the tremor in her hands. The chemical baths smelled of bitter almonds and vinegar, a stark contrast to the smoky air outside. She had taken several plates during the chaotic peak of the battle, guided by instinct more than art. Now, she would see what secrets the night had been willing to give up. She slid the last plate into the developer, rocking the tray gently. An image began to emerge from the milky emulsion, a ghost taking form. It was a scene of fire and fury, the side of a warehouse engulfed in flames, and in the foreground, his face illuminated in a perfect, hellish light, was Jedediah Stone, Pike's foreman. In his hand, he held a burning torch, his mouth open in a triumphant yell. It was not just evidence, it was a confession written in light. When she showed the finished plate to Marshal Fletcher, the lawman did not whistle or exclaim. He simply took the heavy glass, held it to the light, and gave a slow, satisfied nod. His face was a study in grim professionalism. He had been building a case with the quiet patience of a stonemason, and Evelyn had just handed him the keystone. "This," Fletcher said, his voice a low rumble of certainty, "is what a federal judge will call incontrovertible, along with a deposition from our captured friend. Mr. Pike will soon be answering questions he cannot buy his way out of." He placed the photograph carefully into a protective sleeve and began making notes in a small, leather-bound book, his pen scratching against the paper, each stroke another bar in the cage he was building for Silas Pike. Later, sitting at the small desk in her room, Evelyn did what she had come west to do. She wrote. Her pen flew across the pages, the ink staining her fingers. The words poured out of her, fueled by the adrenaline of the fight and the cold anger that had settled in her heart. She titled the article "San Miguel Who Burned Us." She described the sham trial in the saloon, the courage of Attorney Del Rio, the quiet strength of Keshi. She wrote about the greed of the railroad, the terror of the attack, and the resilience of the townspeople who had stood together. It was the most powerful, most honest thing she had ever written, the truth, in all its ugly and beautiful detail. She folded the pages, ready to send them with a morning stagecoach. Her editor would be ecstatic. This was the story that would make her name, the kind of crusading journalism that could effect real change. But her hand hovered over the envelope. A cold unease crept over her, a feeling more unsettling than the fear she had felt on the rooftop. She thought of the words she had written, how they would be read in parlors and offices 1,000 miles away. The story would be simplified. Brave town defeats railroad thugs with help of noble Apache. And then what Pike would be arrested. Yes, but his influence was like a root system, deep and tangled throughout the territory. His men, the ones who had escaped, would not see this as justice. They would see it as a betrayal. Retaliation would be swift, and it would not be aimed at Marshal Fletcher or the now vigilant town. It would be aimed at the easiest, most vulnerable target, the people they already hated, Keshi's people. The article that was meant to be a sword of justice could become the spark that ignited a massacre. She looked at her ink-stained fingers and imagined they were stained with something far worse. Keshi found her staring at the folded pages, her expression lost and troubled. He did not ask what was wrong. He had seen the way the pen and the paper called to her, and he understood the power of the words she commanded. He also understood the burdens that came with such power. He looked at the worry etched on her face, and he made a decision. "There is a place you should see," he said. "A different story than the one you will find in this town." She looked up at him, her eyes full of the conflict that was tearing her apart. She trusted him. After the fire, after the shared terror and the silent understanding in the salt house, trust was the air she breathed when he was near. She nodded, placing the unsealed envelope in a drawer. the story could wait. They rode out of San Miguel, heading not for the harsh plains, but for the rolling foothills that climbed toward the distant, blue mountains. The landscape began to change, the scorched earth giving way to patches of stubborn green. The air grew cooler, cleaner, scented with pine and damp earth. Keishi led her along a path that was nearly invisible, a trail that spoke of long use by feet that knew how to walk without leaving a scar. After a few hours, they descended into a hidden valley, a slash of impossible life cupped in the hands of the rocky hills. A clear stream, the heart of the valley, ran through a meadow of tall grass. Sheltered by the cottonwoods were the wickiups of his people, simple, elegant structures of willow and hide that seemed to have grown from the earth itself. The camp was quiet, a place of purposeful activity. Women scraped hides, their movements economical and practiced. An old man sat in the sun, carefully straightening arrows. Children stopped their play to watch them, their dark eyes wide with a solemn curiosity. No one was hostile, but Evelyn felt their watchfulness, a deep reserve that came from a long and painful history with strangers. She was keenly aware of her otherness, of the space she was taking up in this world that was not hers. Keishi led her to the edge of the stream, where an old woman sat on a smooth, sun-warmed rock. Her face was a beautiful ruin, a testament to a long life of sorrow and joy. Her skin the color and texture of tanned deer hide. Her eyes, however, were bright and sharp, and they missed nothing. Keishi spoke to her in their language, his voice soft with a respect that bordered on reverence. The elder, whose name was Deepwater, looked at Evelyn for a long time. Then she gestured for Evelyn to sit. She had seen the photograph. Keishi had shown it to her. "The fire writing is a powerful thing," Deepwater said, her English slow and thoughtful, like stones being chosen from the riverbed. "It can show a truth that words try to hide." She paused, her gaze distant. "But fire is a tricky spirit. The one who holds the fire also holds the responsibility. You must ask yourself, who will this fire warm and who will it burn?" The simple, metaphorical words went straight to the heart of Evelyn's dilemma. She looked down at her hands, at the faint ink stains that still marked her skin. Her article was a fire. It could shine a light on Pike's crimes and bring the warmth of justice to San Miguel. Or it could leap out of control, burning innocent people who were already living on the edge of destruction. The responsibility was hers. Truth was not a simple thing to be shouted from the rooftops. It was a force that had to be wielded with wisdom and care. Later, as the sun began to set, casting the valley in a soft, golden light, a young woman approached Evelyn and shyly offered her a folded blanket. It was beautifully woven, the pattern a series of interlocking lines that looked like falling rain. It was heavy and smelled of wood smoke and sage. The gift was a quiet, profound gesture of acceptance. Evelyn found Keishi by the stream, watching the water flow over the rocks. She sat beside him, the new blanket wrapped around her shoulders. She had checked the wound on his shoulder earlier. The crude stitches she had made held firm, and the angry redness was gone. The flesh was beginning to knit together, a puckered line that would become another scar, another part of his story. The sight of it healing gave her a sense of hope that felt fragile yet intensely real. "I have been learning how to walk alone for a long time," he said, not looking at her, his voice a low murmur that almost blended with the sound of the water. "It is safer. You learn not to trust the ground that looks too easy. You learn that a promise is just a breath that the wind carries away." He turned to look at her then, and the guardedness she had always seen in his eyes was gone, replaced by a raw honesty. "But in the desert, when you did not break, and in the fire, when you did not run, I have started to trust the ground under my feet again." It was the closest he had ever come to revealing the landscape of his heart. He, who had been betrayed by treaties and laws, was learning to trust a woman whose entire life was built on words and images. Evelyn felt her own heart ache with a feeling so powerful it almost stole her breath. "I understand now," she said softly, her hand resting on the folded article in her lap. "About the fire. The truth is not a weapon to be thrown. It is a tool. It has to be used to build, not just to tear down." She would not send the article. Not yet. First, she would give Marshal Fletcher and his slow, methodical law a chance to work. She would use her fire to provide light, not to start a wildfire. In the quiet of the hidden valley, surrounded by a people who had every reason to hate her, she had found not just a story, but a deeper understanding of her own responsibility. She looked at Keshi, at the healing scar on his shoulder, and felt the first tentative stitches beginning to close around her own guarded heart. The cabin was a simple, sturdy box of logs tucked high in the headwaters, a forgotten remnant of some long-gone prospector's dream. Marshal Fletcher had sent them there. Pike is a caged animal right now, he had warned, and a caged animal is most dangerous right before the hunter comes. Lie low for a few days. Let me work. The journey up had been steep and quiet, each step taking them further from the smoke and anger of the valley and deeper into a world of whispering pines and cold, clear air. The silence inside was a living thing, broken only by the snap and hiss of the fire in the stone hearth and the soft sigh of the wind curling around the eaves. For 2 days, they had existed in this peaceful suspension. The world shrunk to the 4 walls of the cabin. They moved around each other with an unspoken understanding, a rhythm born of shared peril and intuitive trust. She would brew coffee while he split wood for the fire. He would watch the ridgeline with a hunter's stillness while she sat sketching the patterns of frost on the single glass window pane. They were no longer just a photographer and a guide, no longer a woman from the east and a man of the west. Those definitions had been burned away in the fire and washed clean in the desert. They were simply Evelyn and Keshi, 2 people who had seen the deepest parts of each other's courage and fear, and had not looked away. On the 3rd night, a deep cold settled over the mountains. Outside, the stars were chips of ice in a black, velvet sky. Inside, the fire threw dancing shadows on the rough-hewn walls, painting the small room in hues of orange and gold. Evelyn had just finished changing the dressing on Keshi's shoulder. The wound was healing cleanly, the ugly seam she had stitched in the canyon now a tidy, dark line against his skin. Her touch was gentle, practiced, her proximity a comfort he had ceased to question. He sat on the hearth, the warmth of the stone seeping into him, watching her put away the bandages. The firelight caught the red in her hair and softened the determined line of her jaw. He saw in her face the echo of every moment they had shared the dust of the canyon, the terror of the fire, the quiet dignity of the Chiricahua Valley. She was, he realized, the most honest person he had ever known. Her honesty was not in what she said, but in what she saw, and in her refusal to look away from the truth, no matter the cost. She finished her task and turned, her work done, but instead of moving away, she remained before him, caught in the space between them. The air grew thick, charged with all the words they had never spoken. The easy companionship of the past days deepened into something more profound, more fragile. He could see the pulse beating in the delicate skin of her throat. Slowly, as if breaking a spell, she reached out and took his hand. His fingers were calloused and strong, her own slender and cool. She did not intertwine their fingers, but simply held his hand in both of hers, a gesture of profound and simple possession. He saw that her eyes were glistening, wet with an emotion that was not sadness, but something far more overwhelming. Her voice, when she spoke, was barely audible above the crackle of the logs, a sound meant only for him. "Stay tonight," the Virgin whispered. The words were a plea, an invitation, a surrender. She leaned in, her movement fluid and natural, and her lips brushed against his ear. She hesitated for a heart-stopping second, then bit him gently. A touch so light it was like the whisper of a moth's wing, a playful, tender claim that sent a shock of warmth straight through him. It was a gesture of such disarming intimacy, so utterly her own, that it breached the final wall of his warrior's reserve. He turned his head, his face now inches from hers. He saw the universe in her damp, hopeful eyes. He saw a future he had never dared to imagine. He brought his other hand up to cup her cheek, his thumb stroking the line of her jaw. The world outside, with its violence and its lies, ceased to exist. There was only the fire and the small, sacred space between them. His voice was a low, rough murmur, a promise sealed in the quiet of the night. "Till the sun finds us." The Apache kissed her. It was not a kiss of hunger or conquest, but of homecoming. It was long and slow and deep, a patient exploration of a truth they had both been moving toward since the first moment their eyes met across a dusty, violent canyon. It tasted of wood smoke and coffee and the clean, cold air of the mountains. He felt the slight tremble in her lips, the soft sigh that escaped her as she melted against him. She felt the steadfast strength in him, a protective warmth that enveloped her, promising a safety she had never known. It was a kiss that spoke of gratitude, of relief, of a profound and unshakable recognition of one soul for another. It was a healing. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathless, their foreheads resting against each other. The air between them hummed. He reached for the rain-patterned blanket, the gift from his people, that lay folded on a nearby stool. He shook it open and wrapped it around both of them, pulling her close against his side. She leaned her head against his good shoulder, her body fitting against his as if it were made to be there. They sat in silence for a long time, watching the flames dance and weave, cocooned in the warmth of the fire and the soft wool of the blanket. The blanket itself felt like a blessing, a silent acceptance from the world she had so recently entered. The night was no longer a thing to be feared or endured, but a sanctuary. Slowly, the fire burned down to a bed of glowing, orange embers. The shadows in the corners of the room deepened, swallowing the last of the light. But it was not a frightening darkness. It was a peaceful one, a quiet space for two weary souls to rest. As Evelyn drifted toward sleep, her body safe and warm in his embrace, she saw a faint silver line of light appear in a crack between the logs of the cabin wall. It was the first hopeful promise of the dawn. A new day was coming, a day that would find them, just as he had promised, together. The train station at Rio Arriba served a dual purpose. By day, it was a hub of steam, steel, and commerce. But on this afternoon, the main waiting room had been converted into a temporary federal courtroom. The hard wooden benches, usually occupied by weary travelers, now held a tense audience of ranchers, lawyers, and officials. The air smelled of coal smoke, oiled leather, and the dry, papery scent of the law. Presiding over the hearing was Judge Harrison, a man whose stern face and silver-rimmed spectacles suggested he was not easily impressed by wealth or swayed by local politics. Marshal Fletcher stood before him, calm and methodical. He had presented his case with the precision of a watchmaker. He had the sworn confession of the captured Black Flag raider, a damning account of Silas Pike's orders, and now he had Evelyn's photographs, which he presented not as art, but as silent, irrefutable witnesses. "And this, Your Honor," Fletcher said, holding up the plate showing Jedediah Stone with the torch, "was taken the night of the attack. It clearly shows Mr. Pike's own foreman actively engaged in the arson that terrorized the citizens of San Miguel." Judge Harrison leaned forward, peering at the image through his spectacles. A low murmur rippled through the courtroom. The photograph was a cold, hard fact in a case built on rumor and fear. Evelyn sat beside Keshi and Attorney Del Rio. She felt 100 pairs of eyes on her, a mixture of admiration, suspicion, and outright hostility. She felt Keshi's presence beside her, a steady, grounding force. Their time in the cabin had forged a new kind of silence between them, one that was not empty, but full of a deep and unspoken understanding. When it was Silas Pike's turn, his lawyer, a sharp-suited man from Santa Fe, rose with a confident smile. He did not dispute the violence. He redirected it. A tragedy, to be sure. "Your Honor," the lawyer began, his voice smooth as polished wood. "But my client, Mr. Pike, is as much a victim as anyone. He has been the target of a vicious campaign of sabotage by lawless elements who oppose progress in this territory." He then produced his star witness, a homesteader who swore under oath that he had seen a band of Apaches, led by Keshi himself, planning the raids. The man's testimony was smooth, well-rehearsed, and full of convincing details that were all lies. "But the cornerstone of our defense, Your Honor," the lawyer announced with a flourish, "is this." He produced a document from a leather portfolio and handed it to the judge. A legally executed contract, signed and witnessed, in which the Chiricahua tribal elders, including the late chief, willingly sold the parcel of land in question to the Pike and Western Railroad for a generous sum. Mr. Pike was not trespassing. He was developing his own property. The room fell silent. A signed contract. It was a trump card that threatened to undo everything. Judge Harrison examined the document, his expression unreadable. Del Rio leaned forward, his face tight with concern. A legitimate-looking contract could muddy the waters enough for Pike to escape. The judge handed the document to Del Rio for inspection. As Del Rio examined the signatures, Evelyn leaned closer, her eyes drawn not to the writing, but to the paper itself. It was a heavy, creamy vellum, of high quality, and in the corner, held up to the slanting afternoon light, she saw it, a faint, almost invisible watermark embedded in the fibers, an eagle with its wings spread. Her breath caught in her throat. She knew that watermark. She had seen it before. She leaned over and whispered urgently to Del Rio, her voice so low it was barely a breath. "The paper. Ask me where I've seen that paper." Del Rio, trusting her instinct, rose. "Your Honor, we question the authenticity of this document. I would like to call Miss Hart to testify as to the nature of the paper itself." Pike's lawyer laughed. "Object. Your Honor, is this court now to hear testimony from a stationer?" "Miss Hart is a photographer and an expert in paper and chemicals," Del Rio countered. "Her insight is relevant." The judge, his curiosity piqued, nodded. "I will allow it. Proceed. Miss Hart." Evelyn stood, her legs unsteady but her voice clear. All eyes were on her. "Your Honor, a few months ago, I needed to print some notices for the school in San Miguel. I wanted a paper that looked official, to impress upon the parents the importance of the notices. I went to the town hall, where the clerk sold me a few sheets of their best vellum from a locked supply cabinet. It was this exact paper." She paused, letting her words sink in. "It is called Eagle Watermark Vellum. According to the town clerk, it is a specialty paper used exclusively for the printing of official county documents and land deeds. It is not available for public sale." A new kind of murmur swept the room. She had not disproven the signatures. She had done something far more clever. She had proven that the document could not possibly have been created anywhere but inside the San Miguel Town Hall, an office run by men loyal to Silas Pike. She had exposed the forgery's origins. Judge Harrison looked from Evelyn to Silas Pike, a flicker of doubt finally visible in his stern eyes. Seizing the momentum, Del Rio moved in for the final, decisive blow. "And furthermore, Your Honor, even if this fraudulent document were real, it would be irrelevant." He unrolled a large map across his table, the same survey map he had brought to the saloon. He then produced a second, older document, a fragile parchment. "This is a certified copy of the 1866 treaty between the United States government and the Chiricahua Apache. And this," he said, laying the treaty map carefully over the survey map, "shows the truth." The two maps, one layered on top of the other, told a story that needed no words. The bold red line of Pike's Railroad cut a defiant path directly through the clearly marked green expanse of the treaty lands. The truth was literally covering the lie. "We have a witness to corroborate this boundary," Del Rio announced, and gestured to the back of the courtroom. Keishi rose and walked to the rear, returning with the elder, Nachai. Nachai's steps were slow but steady. He stood before the judge, his weathered face a mask of solemn dignity. "Can you tell the court how you know where the boundary lies?" Del Rio asked gently. Nachai spoke, his voice surprisingly strong, a language of the earth translated into English. "It is not a line of ink, it is a line of stones. Our fathers and their fathers placed them, one on the tall mesa, shaped like a sleeping man, one by the river where the 3 cottonwoods grow together. They are the bones of the agreement. I saw Mr. Pike's men myself. They came in the night with mules and ropes. They moved the stone from the river. They tried to change the memory of the earth, but the earth does not forget." The testimony, so simple and so powerful, was devastating. The fraudulent contract, the trespassing railroad, the moved markers, the entire conspiracy was laid bare. Silas Pike's face, which had been a mask of calm confidence, was now a thundercloud of pure fury. The law had failed him, his money had failed him. He was cornered. He locked eyes with Sheriff Baines, who stood near the courtroom doors. Pike gave a barely perceptible nod, a silent, deadly command. He stood up abruptly. "This is an outrage," he shouted. "Creating a diversion, this court is a circus." In the ensuing commotion, Baines and 2 other men loyal to Pike slipped out into the hallway. Marshal Fletcher, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, saw the movement. "Stay here," he said in a low voice to Evelyn, and moved to follow them. The moment Fletcher stepped into the corridor, the trap was sprung. The 2 men lunged at him, while Baines drew his pistol. But they had underestimated the marshal, and they had forgotten about Keishi. Keishi moved with a silent, explosive speed that seemed impossible. He was not a man of courtrooms, but of action. He launched himself past Fletcher, knocking Baines's gun arm upwards just as it fired. The shot went wild, blasting a chunk of plaster from the ceiling. Fletcher, free to act, disabled one of his attackers with a brutally efficient strike to the throat. The second man turned to face Keishi. Pulling a knife, it was a foolish, fatal mistake. Keishi disarmed him with a fluid wrist lock that made the man cry out in pain, sending the knife clattering across the floor. The fight was over in less than 5 seconds. 2 of Pike's men were groaning on the floor, and Fletcher had Sheriff Baines pinned against the wall, his own pistol pressed firmly under the sheriff's chin. "It is over, Baines," Fletcher said, his voice cold and hard. Pike stood in the courtroom doorway, his face a mask of disbelief. He was exposed, his hired muscle defeated, his corrupt sheriff captured. The law he had tried to twist and break had finally closed its fist around him. Fletcher shoved Baines toward a deputy. "Put him in irons. You are an officer of the law?" "Baines," he said, his voice laced with contempt, "you are going to start acting like one, even if it is from inside a federal cell." The Battle of Rio Arriba was over. Justice had won. Not with a single dramatic blow, but with the careful layering of truths, a photograph on a glass plate, a watermark on a piece of paper, and an old map laid carefully upon a new one. Silas Pike did not wait for the judge's gavel to fall. While the courtroom was still processing the raw truth of the layered maps and the old man's testimony, Pike was already moving. He was not a man accustomed to losing, and he did not intend to start now. With the chaos of the hallway skirmish as his cover, he slipped out a side door, commandeered a horse, and rode south. He rode with the singular focus of a cornered wolf fleeing a forest fire, not toward safety, but back to the heart of his power, back to San Miguel. He was a man who believed that if you could not win by the rules, you burned the rule book, the courthouse, and the entire town it stood in. News of his flight reached San Miguel on the telegraph wires an hour before Pike himself arrived. It was a stark, simple message from Marshal Fletcher: "Pike is coming. He will burn the evidence. Prepare." There was no panic this time. The night of the Black Flag attack had burned the fear out of the town, replacing it with a hard, tempered resolve. This was not Pike's town anymore. It was theirs. As the sun began its long, slow descent, painting the western sky in brilliant strokes of orange and crimson, Main Street transformed. It was the golden hour, a time that usually softened the harsh lines of the frontier town. But tonight, the light seemed to sharpen every edge, to illuminate the coming conflict. Barricades of wagons and stacked crates now stood at either end of the street. Windows that were usually bright with lantern light were dark, shuttered eyes. The town was holding its breath. Inside the marshal's office, the final plan was laid. It was a plan born of their combined strengths. Keshi, with a small, hand-picked team of ranchers who could move as silently as he could, would not wait for the attack. They would proactively neutralize the threat. Their target was the secondary oil and kerosene depot on the east side of town, the one the Black Flag had not used, the one Pike would need for his final, desperate act of arson. Evelyn, once again, was tasked with the water tower, but her role had evolved. She was not just a lookout. She was the commander of the town's eyes. With a large signal mirror and a carefully worked-out set of codes, she would be the nerve center, using the last rays of the setting sun to communicate the enemy's movements to Fletcher's riflemen, who were now positioned on the rooftops. As she climbed the ladder, the mirror strapped to her back, she felt the familiar knot of fear. But it was different now. It was a cold, clear-headed fear, the kind a general feels before a battle, not the frantic terror of a cornered animal. From her perch, she saw the whole board. She saw Keshi and his men melt into the shadows of the alleyways. She saw the glint of rifle barrels on the rooftops. She saw the empty waiting stage of Main Street below. Pike arrived with the last of the light, at the head of a dozen die-hard loyalists, the remnants of the Black Flag, who were more loyal to his money than their own lives. They did not charge wildly. This was not a raid. It was an execution. Their goal was the town hall and the marshal's office, where the physical evidence, the forged contracts, the depositions was stored. Evelyn caught the first glint of their approach. She angled her mirror, sending a sharp, brilliant flash of golden light toward the roof of the general store. A signal was returned. Fletcher's men were ready. The fight, when it came, was brutally short. As Pike's men thundered onto Main Street, they were met not with a panicked defense, but with a disciplined, coordinated crossfire. Riders tumbled from their saddles. Horses screamed and reared. The organized charge dissolved into a confused scramble for cover. Pike, seeing his frontal assault failing, screamed an order toward his lieutenants, gesturing toward the east. The depot, burn it from that end. Evelyn saw the movement. She pivoted her mirror, flashing a frantic, repeated signal toward the eastern rooftops. But no fire came. Keshi and his men had already done their work. They had not blown the depot. They had simply opened the taps, letting the flammable oil drain harmlessly into the thirsty sand beneath the warehouse. The monster had been defanged. Realizing his plan was unraveling, Pike's eyes, full of a rabid fury, scanned the town for the source of his defeat. He saw the flashes of light from the water tower, and he understood. He snarled, a feral sound of pure hatred, and spurred his horse directly toward the tower, two of his remaining men following close behind. Evelyn saw them coming. She scrambled down the ladder, her mind racing. This time there was no alley, no easy escape. She ran out into the open, hoping to draw them away from the town center. Pike was on her in seconds. He leaned down from his saddle, his powerful arm sweeping her off her feet. He dragged her in front of him, a human shield, and wheeled his horse around to face the silent, watching rooftops. He held a pistol to her head. "The fight is over," he bellowed, his voice raw with desperation. Main Street fell silent, the last echoes of gunfire fading into an unbearable tension. "Drop your guns, or the photographer dies." Keshi emerged from the alley near the far end of the street, a rifle in his hands. Marshal Fletcher's voice called down from the roof of the saddlery. "Let her go. Pike, there is no way out." "I will make a way out," Pike screamed, his grip tightening on Evelyn. "Progress requires sacrifice. This town is a sacrifice I am willing to make to see this territory move forward." Evelyn, held tight against Pike's chest, the cold steel of the pistol against her temple, found her voice. It did not shake. "Progress does not require you to burn poor people out of their homes. Mr. Pike," she said, her words clear and carrying in the still air. "That is not progress. That is just greed." Pike laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "The weak are always trampled by the strong. It is the law of nature." At the far end of the street, Casey slowly, deliberately, lowered his rifle and placed it on the ground. He held his empty hands up. The move was so unexpected, so contrary to the violent logic of the moment, that it stunned Pike into a moment of inaction. "What are you doing?" Pike snarled, his eyes fixed on Keshi. "You want a target?" "Pike," Keshi called out, his voice steady. "Here I am. Let her go, and you can deal with me, the man you truly hate." Pike's eyes gleamed with triumph. This, he understood, the warrior's challenge. He saw weakness in Keshi's gesture. He nudged his horse forward, dragging Evelyn with him, pulling Keshi's full attention, moving them both toward the center of the empty street, into a clear and open space. It was the opening Fletcher had been waiting for. From the rooftop, the marshal's rifle cracked. A single, sharp report that broke the spell. It was not a killing shot. It was the shot of a surgeon, a lawman. The bullet struck Pike's gun hand, shattering the bone. The pistol flew from his grasp. The horse, terrified by the sudden shock and the man's cry of pain, reared violently. Pike was thrown from the saddle, landing hard in the dust. Before he could recover, Keshi was on him. In the same instant, Fletcher's deputies swarmed from their positions. It was over. The remaining Black Flag riders threw down their guns in surrender. The people of San Miguel began to emerge from their homes and businesses. A tentative cheer went up, then grew louder, a wave of relief and victory washing over the street. They started to surge forward, their faces hard with anger, their eyes on the captured Pike. A mob. So recently, a disciplined defense force was beginning to form again. But before they could take a single vengeful step, Keshi's voice cut through the rising clamor. He stood over the defeated Pike, but he spoke to the town. No, his voice was not a shout, but a command that carried an undeniable authority. There has been enough blood. We have fought for the law. Now we will let the law do its work. There will be no more killing. Not here, not tonight. He stood between the crowd and their target, not as a warrior, but as a guardian of the peace they had just won. He looked at them, and they looked back, and in that moment, they saw not an Apache, but one of their own, a leader who was asking them to be their best selves. The angry murmur subsided. The forward surge stopped. They looked at each other, at the wreckage on their street, and they nodded. They had chosen law over the rope, and they would not go back. They would end the violence with order, not with more violence. As the deputies hauled a broken and cursing Silas Pike to his feet, binding his hands, the last sliver of the sun disappeared below the horizon. The golden hour was over. A new, uncertain twilight had begun. The seasons turned, washing the scars of the fire from the face of San Miguel. The winter rains came, tamping down the red dust and clearing the air of its smoky ghosts. By the time the spring sun warmed the valley again, the town was not the same one that Silas Pike had tried to break. It was stronger, quieter, and more watchful. The sound of hammers now rang from the end of Main Street, but they were not laying rails. They were raising the walls of a new schoolhouse, a sturdy wooden building with real glass windows, built on land donated by a rancher who had once stood on Pike's jury. The federal court's decision had been slow in coming, but decisive. Pike was gone, his assets seized, his name now a curse whispered in the saloons he once owned. Sheriff Baines was serving a long sentence for corruption and attempted murder, and the railroad, under new, court-appointed management, had been forced to honor the treaties. From the top of the water tower, you could now see the new line of track being laid, a great, shining curve that respectfully skirted the edge of the Chiricahua lands, a silent, steel testament to the fact that progress did not have to mean destruction. The line of power had been bent to the line of justice. Evelyn Hart found she had no desire to return to Boston. The muted grays and damp air of her old life felt like a faded photograph compared to the vivid, challenging reality of San Miguel. She used the money from her Eastern Gazette to purchase the old assayer's office, a small, dusty building with a good north-facing window. She converted it into a proper photography studio. The sign she hung outside was simple. Hand-painted letters E, Hart, Photographic Arts. The people of the town, who had once viewed her and her strange machine with suspicion, now came to her to have their lives chronicled. She captured the proud, tired faces of miners, the shy smiles of newly married couples, and the solemn dignity of Mexican families who had called this place home for generations. She was no longer an outsider documenting a story. She was the town's memory keeper. One afternoon, a package arrived on the stagecoach. Inside was a stack of newspapers, fresh from the presses in the East. On the front page was her article. Printed under the title she had finally chosen, San Miguel, The Day We Chose Law. The story was accompanied by the stark, powerful reproduction of her photograph of Jedediah Stone, his face illuminated by the fire he had started. She had told the truth, not as a weapon of vengeance, but as a careful record of a community's choice. The story was not about a lone hero or a savage villain. It was about ordinary people who, when tested, had found an extraordinary courage. Marshal Fletcher stayed on in San Miguel, his temporary assignment having become a permanent one. The territory needed a lawman who could not be bought. One afternoon, he found Casey watching the new schoolhouse being built, the sounds of saws and laughter filling the air. "I have a proposition for you," Fletcher said, leaning against a stack of fresh lumber. He pulled a folded document from his coat. "It is an official contract. I need a man who understands this land, who understands the people, both settlers and native. Someone to act as a special deputy, an advisor on land disputes and treaty matters. The pay is good. The authority is real." He held out the paper, offering Casey a badge, a salary, a place within the white man's world of law. Casey looked at the document, at the official seal and the neat lines of legal text. He saw the path it offered: a steady wage, a respected position, a chance to work for justice from the inside. He thought of the long, bitter history of his people, of the endless chain of broken promises written on papers just like that one. Then he looked at Fletcher, a man he respected, a man who had proven his word was as solid as the granite of the mountains. "My people have a saying," Casey said, his voice quiet. "A man who tries to stand in two canoes at once will end up in the river." He did not take the paper. "I will help you. When you need me to read the land or speak to the elders, I will be there. But I cannot wear your badge. I cannot belong to your world." Fletcher looked disappointed, but he nodded, understanding. You would rather walk between them. A bridge must have footing on both sides. "Marshal," Casey replied, "or it is of no use to anyone." He was no longer a man haunted by the past, but a man defined by his freedom to choose his own path, a path that served his people and the fragile peace they had all fought for. In the days that followed, a new rhythm settled between them. Sometimes he would be gone for weeks, living with his people in the hidden valley. Other times he would appear at her studio door at dusk, and they would share a simple meal, their conversation a comfortable silence punctuated by the small details of their separate lives. Their love was not a thing of grand proclamations or desperate embraces. It was a quiet, steady fire, a deeply rooted plant that had grown in the harshest soil and blossomed against all odds. One morning, before the world was fully awake, they rode out onto the prairie. The air was cold and clean, and the eastern sky was a pale, promising gray. They stopped on a low rise overlooking the valley, the place where he had first watched the town's smoke so long ago. He dismounted and helped her down, wrapping the rain-patterned blanket around her shoulders against the chill. They stood together, watching the horizon begin to burn with color. The new railroad tracks in the distance caught the first rays of light, gleaming like a silver river that had been taught a new, more gentle course. The new schoolhouse was a dark, solid shape, waiting for the children's voices to fill it. San Miguel was at peace. Evelyn leaned her head against his shoulder, the rough fabric of his shirt familiar and comforting. The long journey, from the dusty canyon to the fiery night to the quiet cabin, had led them here, to this moment of profound and simple stillness. She thought of the promise he had made on the night that had changed everything, a promise whispered in the dark that had become the foundation of her new life. She turned her face up to his, her voice a soft murmur in the vast silence of the dawn. "Till the sun finds us." A slow smile touched Keishi's lips, crinkling the corners of his eyes. He looked down at her, his expression full of a love that was as wide and as endless as the land around them. He gently brushed a stray strand of hair from her cheek, his touch both a question and an answer. "And after that, too," he said. "Thank you for listening to the story. We invite you to comment where you are listening from so we can all connect and share our thoughts. And to please subscribe to the Wild West Tales channel, like this video, and press the hype button to support us and help this story be heard by more people."